Most people think the safest thing to do during a traffic stop is simple. Roll the window down, smile politely, answer whatever the officer asks, and hope the whole thing ends quickly. And that assumption, so common, so automatic, is exactly what gets people into trouble. Not because officers are evil, not because every traffic stop is a trap, but because the legal structure of a traffic stop was never designed to protect the comfort of the driver. It was designed to gather information. And information, in the hands of law enforcement, has a way of becoming evidence. So before you roll down your window during a traffic stop, there is something you need to understand about how these encounters actually work in the real world, not in the movies, not in the polite little diagrams people imagine, but in the messy reality of body camera footage, courtroom transcripts, and suppression hearings where every word you said gets replayed, slowed down, and dissected. Because I've sat in those courtrooms, I've watched judges lean forward while a clip plays on a monitor. I've watched juries see a single sentence repeated over and over until it becomes the centerpiece of an entire case. And almost every time, it started with a moment that felt small. A driver rolls down the window. The officer asks a casual question. The driver answers without thinking. That moment seems harmless, but legally, it's not. The phrase I want you to remember is this: I'm complying, but I'm not answering questions. Not aggressive, not confrontational, not dramatic, just calm, clear, and controlled. I'm complying, but I'm not answering questions. Now here's where people immediately get uncomfortable. They think saying something like that will make the officer angry. They imagine flashing lights, raised voices, a tense confrontation on the side of the road, and maybe you're thinking the same thing right now. Maybe you're thinking the smartest move is to keep things friendly, to cooperate, to answer whatever they ask so the officer can do their job. But this is the part most people misunderstand. There is a difference, legally and practically, between complying and volunteering information. Compliance means you follow lawful orders. If an officer asks for your license, registration, and proof of insurance, you provide them. If they tell you to step out of the vehicle, the law in the United States generally allows them to order you out during a traffic stop, and refusing that order can escalate the situation quickly. But answering questions? That's different, and this is where things get complicated. Because traffic stops exist in a strange legal space where two constitutional principles collide. On one side, the government has the authority to temporarily detain you if they have reasonable suspicion that a traffic violation occurred. On the other side, you still have constitutional protections, including the right not to incriminate yourself. That right doesn't disappear just because there are flashing lights behind your car. But officers know something about human psychology that most drivers don't fully appreciate in the moment. People hate silence. When someone in authority asks a question, the instinct to answer is almost automatic. It feels rude not to, suspicious even. And that instinct becomes even stronger when adrenaline is pumping and your brain is trying to resolve the tension of the moment as quickly as possible. So the officer walks up to your car, leans slightly toward the window, maybe resting a hand near the door frame, voice calm, casual, almost friendly. Do you know why I stopped you? It sounds harmless. It sounds conversational. But let me be honest with you. That question has ended more legal defenses than almost any other sentence in traffic enforcement. Because the moment you answer it, you've stepped into a different legal landscape. If you say, "Yeah, I think I was going a little fast," you've just admitted the violation. If you say, "I didn't see the stop sign," you've acknowledged the conduct. If you say, "I was just trying to keep up with traffic," you've placed yourself in the behavior being investigated, and suddenly, what could have been a disputed allegation becomes your own statement on record. This is the trap. Not a malicious trap necessarily. Officers are trained to gather information, and asking questions is part of that process. But the effect is the same. You become the evidence. Now, this is the part most people misunderstand about rights during traffic stops. Invoking your rights doesn't mean you're fighting the officer. It means you're setting boundaries about what information you're volunteering. And the simplest boundary, the one that works without escalating tension, is that phrase again. I'm complying, but I'm not answering questions. Notice what it does. It signals cooperation while asserting a right. You're not refusing lawful commands. You're not being argumentative. You're simply declining to participate in an interview. because that's what those roadside conversations really are. Interviews. The officer may phrase things casually. Where are you coming from tonight? Have you had anything to drink? How long have you been driving? Whose car is this? Individually, each question seems harmless. Together, they create a narrative, a timeline, a series of statements that can later be compared, analyzed, and sometimes contradicted. And contradictions, even small ones, have a strange way of growing in importance inside a courtroom. Now let me tell you about a case that illustrates this perfectly. A man was stopped late at night for drifting slightly within his lane, not crossing lines, not speeding, just a small movement that an officer described as possible impairment. When the officer approached the car, he asked the usual questions. Where are you coming from? The driver answered. Just left a friend's place. How much have you had to drink tonight? The driver paused, nervous, adrenaline rising. Just a beer earlier. The officer continued the conversation. More questions, more small answers. By the end of the stop, the driver had admitted to drinking, described the location he left, estimated the time, and explained his route home. None of that seemed dramatic in the moment, but when the case reached court, those statements became the backbone of the prosecution, because the officer later wrote in the report that the driver's timeline didn't match the distance traveled. The location he described had a bar attached to it. The one beer earlier statement became evidence suggesting alcohol consumption before driving. And suddenly, the entire case wasn't about lane drifting anymore. It was about the driver's own words. Now here's where this gets complicated. If you refuse to answer questions politely, the stop might take longer. Officers are human beings, and human beings react to perceived resistance, even calm resistance. Let me be honest with you. Asserting your rights may inconvenience you. You may wait longer on the side of the road while the officer runs records checks or decides how to proceed. The tone of the encounter might shift slightly. The friendly conversation may disappear. That's the hard truth. But inconvenience and self-incrimination are not the same thing. And in my experience reviewing hundreds of body camera recordings, the drivers who get into the most legal trouble are rarely the ones who stayed silent. It's almost always the ones who talk too much, because adrenaline does strange things to the human brain. Your heart rate spikes, your breathing changes, your mind starts racing. The simple act of answering questions while nervous can lead to rambling explanations, unnecessary details, or statements that don't come out the way you intended. You might try to sound cooperative, you might try to sound honest, but honesty under stress often becomes oversharing, and oversharing creates evidence. So the moment the officer approaches your vehicle, before the window comes all the way down, before the conversation begins to flow naturally, you need to remember that central phrase. I'm complying, but I'm not answering questions. Notice something important about that sentence. It's calm. It's respectful. It doesn't accuse the officer of anything. It simply defines your role in the encounter. You're complying with the stop. You're providing documents, you're following lawful orders, but you're not participating in an investigative conversation. Now, officers may try to move around that boundary. They might rephrase questions. They might say something like, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. Or, if you didn't do anything wrong, why not just answer? And this is where the psychology of authority comes into play. Humans are wired to justify themselves when questioned by someone in power. The instinct to explain is powerful. But explanation is often exactly what investigators are hoping for, because explanations can be compared with observations, timelines can be checked, details can be analyzed, and sometimes even innocent explanations become suspicious simply because they contain small inconsistencies. So if the officer asks again, you repeat the phrase. I'm complying, but I'm not answering questions. Not louder, not angrier, just steady. Now let's talk about body language, because words are only part of what officers evaluate during a stop. If your tone is calm but your body language is tense, sudden movements, raised voice, aggressive posture, you create mixed signals that can escalate the encounter. So keep your hands visible, move slowly when retrieving documents, maintain a neutral tone. You're not trying to win an argument, you're simply maintaining a boundary. And here's something else people rarely think about. Officers are trained to watch for signs of nervousness, but almost everyone is nervous during a traffic stop. Even perfectly innocent drivers show elevated heart rate, shaky hands, and anxious behavior. Adrenaline does not mean guilt, but excessive talking often amplifies those signs. Because when people talk while nervous, they fill silence with explanations, jokes, apologies, and guesses. Each sentence becomes another variable, another detail, another piece of information that didn't exist before. This is where it turns. Because if an officer believes they have developed reasonable suspicion of another offense, maybe DUI, maybe drug possession, maybe something unrelated to the original stop, the scope of the encounter can expand. And that expansion often begins with conversation. Now here's the nuance. There are situations where limited communication is unavoidable. If an officer gives direct instructions, you follow them. If they ask for identification, you provide it. If they explain the reason for the stop, you listen. The phrase does not mean refusing to acknowledge the officer. It means declining to answer investigative questions. And that distinction matters, because courts often examine whether a driver was cooperative in terms of compliance, not whether they volunteered information. Now, suppose the officer ignores your statement and keeps asking questions anyway. That happens sometimes. In that situation, the most effective approach is consistency. You don't argue. You don't lecture about constitutional rights. You simply repeat the boundary. I'm complying, but I'm not answering questions. Eventually, one of two things happens. The officer either proceeds with the stop based on the information they already have, or they escalate the investigation based on independent observations. But either way, your own words have not added new evidence to the situation, and that can make a significant difference later, especially if the case ever reaches a courtroom. Because when I review body camera footage for a defense case, one of the first things I look for is the driver's statements. Did they admit something? Did they contradict themselves? Did they guess about something they weren't sure of? Or did they remain calm, compliant, and quiet? You'd be surprised how often silence creates stronger legal defenses than explanations ever could. And yet most people never rehearse silence. They rehearse politeness. They rehearse apologies. They rehearse explanations. But when the flashing lights appear in the rearview mirror, the brain falls back on whatever behavior feels natural in the moment. Which is why that phrase matters so much. I'm complying, but I'm not answering questions. It gives your brain something simple to hold on to when adrenaline is high and the situation feels uncertain. Because traffic stops are strange encounters. Two strangers meeting on the side of a road under unequal authority, one asking questions, the other trying to get home. And in that moment, the line between cooperation and self-incrimination can be thinner than people realize. So before the window rolls down all the way, before the conversation begins, remember the reality behind those flashing lights. The roadside conversation may feel casual, but legally, it can echo for months inside a courtroom. And the simplest way to control that echo is to control what you say. I'm complying, but I'm not answering questions. Practice it. Say it out loud. Make it automatic. Because when the moment arrives, and for most drivers it eventually does, you won't have time to think through constitutional law, suppression hearings, or evidentiary rules. You'll have a few seconds, an open window, and an officer waiting for an answer, and what you say in that moment can shape everything that follows.